Yeah.
Make its type of blob.
I'll be honest, I don't think
Yeah. Well, you want to chunk it up so that it matches your partitions, cluster sizes, and things like that, so you can stream it out. But you can use it to just literally stream the data instead of
Does it scale as well as the Couch and Mondo?
That I haven't tested.
No. Because that's the big plus with those things, right? It stays fast all the time.
The one command scale option with add user, there's like a Mondo.
so. Man,
Just type in command add text. It's like nothing.
Alright.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
so when I've done this talk once before. I gave it at UTOSC camp, but the title wasn't this backbone Hogan title. It was actually this title. It was a title called the browser is the platform. And the problem with that is it attracted like a lot of really kind of non-technical people who I think they wanted to learn about the Chrome Web Store or something. I don't know, but like my overwhelming feedback was like, oh, it's way too complicated. And so I was actually really nervous. I was like, oh, maybe I should cut down and focus in on one thing. But then I spent a ton of time trying to come up with a metaphor between AMD and a philosopher, because that always has some sort of impact. And this is like a 1400s philosopher picture. I'm like, this guy relates to AMD, But unfortunately, it didn't work out. And I kind of banked that this being open source would be more of a technical crowd. So hopefully you guys will enjoy. So, oh yes, the best picture on the internet.com. This is actually a real website, and it changed my life. The contrast is actually not doing it justice, but it's just something about this is really moving. I don't know what it is. And also, at any point in time, feel free to email my boss and tell him that I'm awesome. I need a raise, things like that, but I don't actually need a raise, but I would love it if you guys told them I'm great. Everyone write that email down. Alright, so my name is Merrick Christensen. I work at Domo, where we do, well, this is being recorded, so I'm not sure what my PR people want me to say, so I'll say we're revamping business intelligence. In the past, I've done lots of high-profile websites for lots of these, name-dropper brands, but really it's just code, same way. I love coding. I spend lots of time on open source channels, mostly focused on this kind of client-side architecture right now. I think it's just a blast, and it's moving so fast that that's cool. And this is a really happy picture of me. It's pretty happy. All right, so what I'm going to talk about, moving your application logic to the browser. What was your name?
Jason.
Jason made a point that he likes JavaScript because you can move your UI to the client, and you can relegate your services to kind of just be your APIs, and they can focus more on security, performance, scalability, these kinds of things. And that's pretty much exactly what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about one approach to that today. There's a number of approaches. This is one that I've used a number of times and iterated on, and I quite like it. Adding structure and modularity to your client code. This is where RequireJS, or AMD, which stands for Asynchronous Module Definition, comes into play. How many of you guys are installing globals and namespacing stuff? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I know there's some shame admitting to that, but it's normal. We're going to talk about getting around that. These are the technologies that we're going to be focused on today. I know I said Hogan. I'm actually going to use Handlebars.js. They're actually the same thing in large part. They're both compilers for a templating language. And anything that's valid, Mustache, is actually going to get compiled by Handlebars as well. So, sorry if you guys wanted a Hogan right now, I can give you one later. Alright, so the problem is DOM-coupled, non-maintainable, global dependent, round-trip to the server code. You constantly are having people who are making these requests to the server to get their markup, right? They're getting their markup, they're taking it down, it's in the document object model, and they're taking jQuery or insert other hipster library here, and then they're grabbing DOM elements and they're making a public namespace. You have this kind of noodly code. Problem is it's not very scalable. Also requires like a middle tier between your services that you're going to have to implement for just your web services, and it's just not very maintainable. So this is the kind of code I'm talking about. I actually pulled this out of the Rails repository, like not long ago at all. So, like I said, they're keeping all of their state in the DOM, which is just about the slowest way to store your state. And then I hope this guy comes in. There's not very many people in here. People, there's more. Yeah, don't worry about it, man. Don't worry about it. I don't have feelings. Alright. So, anyways, so you're pulling these like stuff out of the DOM, right? They're grabbing attributes and they're doing this weird sort of, they're really coupling their DOM to their JavaScript logic. And so, A, that's not very maintainable. B, the DOM is about the slowest way to write an app. And also you have all these kind of intrusive things you wouldn't expect being connected, right? Like if I change the UJS submit button, that's game over for me. Even worse, this is from W3 Schools. This is the kind of stuff that makes me not want to build web apps anymore. This is like the general education going around. They're like, hey guys, this is what I do. And then I like weep on the phone to my mom for a few hours so I can maintain somebody's code that's like this. You got this gross sort of attribute function tied stuff. Everybody's seen this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Probably done this kind of stuff. I have too, don't worry. I've been building web apps, and when I started, it wasn't this bad. I never did it this bad. I was definitely this bad though. But I was like still in diapers when people are doing it like this. Alright, so the problem with this approach. Code and state revolving around the DOM grows unmaintainably pretty much instantly. You have all these different templates that your server's compiling, and then you have this sort of abstract layer that's manipulating this markup, and eventually it just becomes kind of a mess. There's no structure, there's no real design patterns. Historically, everyone just shoves everything into like the $sign object, you know? Like, when you have a $sign, it's money. Like everybody just, like they thrive on that. They're like, oh, this isn't really dependent on jQuery, but I can make it a jQuery plugin and get like 1,000 more downloads. I'm guilty of that. I was like, sometimes like if I hang this off the $sign, people will respect it more than they do. It's just a sad thought, but global variables are everywhere. Somebody will do something like window.app is equal to, or window.namespace, and they'll shove everything inside of there. And there's no real protection against that. You can forget, there's just no protection of that. There's no immediately invoke function invocation to protect you from accidentally doing that. And it feels really natural to add more. Just say window.models, and then store all your models in there. And say window.controllers, and store all your controllers in there. And eventually you have a whole bunch of keys that make your code far less maintainable. Or modular if you wanted to grab, say, your controllers, take it to another site who also has a controllers key, and then you have to do some sort of merging, and it's just not a very fun way to live. Like I said, the DOM is about the slowest way to write an app. It's not only less maintainable, but when you're grabbing stuff out of the DOM, doing stuff with it, I'm being a dead horse, and it's intentional, it's painfully slow, not just unmaintainable. You actually run performances on it, performance test, it's usually better construct strings. And inner HTML actually got a huge boost in Safari, so for WebKit I should say. There's no structure to it. Like literally, I'm pretty sure this is like a motto in the jQuery community. Grab something and do something to it, and then yeah, I think that's like promoted talk around there. So first thing I want to talk about, getting rid of those globals and making our code more modular. So, if I wanted to take some code from somebody else and implement it into my app in JavaScript, typically they install something global. So if I wanted to take like some interesting, DOM manipulation tool, and I wanted to use it, it's basically like put this script tag on your page and you'll have access to this function. But now I've got this global added to it, and globals are kind of intrinsically bad. Not always, but it's just not, it can blast away your code, it can carry its own dependencies and install globals that you weren't aware was going to install, and the APIs are not uniform, so if you wanted to grab it and take it elsewhere, you have to make sure that it conforms with your app's namespace. And historically, the approach to this was like, everybody owns a key, right? Everybody owns, I own jQuery, I own UE. Problem is that didn't work very well. Oh, there's... Sorry about that, guys. By the way, if like any of you guys want to focus on any particular text more than the other ones, please let me know. If anything I say is like ridiculously stupid, also let me know. I can totally deal with the embarrassment. And if anybody's like, this sucks, I want to leave, my feelings won't be hurt at all. Well, maybe a little bit. But. So, anyways, AMD stands for Asynchronous Module Definition. There's been a ton of attempts to bring modules into JavaScript. There's been CommonJS, which is more of a server layer thing. There's nowadays AMD, which is good because it's, don't worry about it, parallel stuff. And so you can download things parallel, and once they're all done, it will then hand you all the things that it downloaded. What's nice about the module specification is now I can say, okay, give me this guy's code, and I'm going to use it as this. And his code is actually all anonymous, and he just exports an interface that I can consume. If you're familiar with like Python or Ruby or Java or anything like that, it's very normal to just say, okay, I'm going to have this jar, and then I'm going to import it, and then I'm going to reference it. In JavaScript, unfortunately, it's not been like that historically. It's like, I'm going to have this jar, and then it's going to install everything in my scope, right? That's what the equivalent of is in JavaScript. And any object-oriented programmer can tell you that that's an inefficient way to write code. So we've got this asynchronous loading, so meaning all of your dependencies will be downloading at the same time. It helps you think about modular code. This is, in my opinion, the biggest win. It lets you think, okay, I need to export an interface that this person's going to consume. It's less about the performance gains, because honestly, you won't often get the performance gains when writing AMD modules. You would build those and get similar performance. Completely getting rid of globals. In AMD, everything is abstracted into these closures. And then there's excellent community adoption. AMD has massive momentum. It's got jQuery support. Dojo is dependent on it for the entire framework. MooTools is also AMD based. Well, MooTools 2 is AMD based. So a lot of people are moving to this common definition. So now if I want to compose something of these multiple frameworks, I can say require jQuery and then require class from MooTools. So now I can use MooTools class with jQuery DOM manipulation tools. And I can kind of compose things where they're best rather than say, and it's too bad MooTools blasts the $sign and jQuery blasts the $sign because now I have to do some no conflict work. It does come with a build tool, so you're not making tons of requests. You run it runs in Node.js, and it's actually really awesome. It traces all of your dependencies and compiles them into one file, and it will uglify it if you want, or it'll even run it through like Google Closure optimizations, things like that. Supports strategic loading. So say I intentionally want to defer the loading of a certain piece of my application. Say I want to, I like to give the Gmail example. If I'm lazily loading chat, because most users aren't actually interacting with chat most of the time, they're going to Gmail. They're going in there and they're checking their mail and they're leaving. So we can give them some performance improvements by lazily loading chat when they click on it. AMD lends itself to this, where CommonJS does not. So it's very browser-centric. So now I can say, okay, they click chat, go get the code, initialize the module. They do support CommonJS syntax with a wrapper. So if you like the CommonJS approach, which is what's used in the Node community, you can use that. There's lots of useful AMD plugins. So now I get to So what I'm going to do actually this time around is I'm going to show you how you're going to just grab this RequireJS code. I just went to requirejs.org. And I'm going to make an index HTML file for it, for my web app. So now I've got RequireJS, and I have an index.html. Can you guys see this, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Now I'm going to just make like a lib directory for my code. I'm just going to open this up in an editor. So, in case the command line was too ambiguous for you, it's got just RequireJS in a regular RequireJS file, and I've got index.html, which is empty. So, I've included RequireJS using a regular script tag. Nothing too abstract here. This is how you include any other library, right? So RequireJS is going to install two globals, require and define, and that's all you should have when you're using an AMD thing. The thing about AMD is don't get it intermixed with RequireJS. They're actually, AMD is a specification that's implemented by RequireJS. There's 7 or 8 loaders that I could name off the top of my head that implement the same specification that you could replace RequireJS with. RequireJS has kind of just led the charge a little bit. So if I build this node server, and I go to that winning folder on my desktop, and I'm going to serve it. Okay. So now what we can do is we can give RequireJS what's called a main attribute, and we can say your main is going to be like this. So if you're familiar with a compiled language like Java, you typically have a main function. It's kind of the entry point to your application, and you can move forward with that. It's actually kind of a nice programming pattern because you can trace all of the way your app goes from entry point outwards, whereas in JavaScript, things can just do things all over the place. So now we're going to make that main file, and this is what a RequireJS or AMD module looks like. You call this define keyword, you pass it a closure. So now what we can do is I can console log run in here, and see how RequireJS went and got that JavaScript file, and it loaded it on the page, and we console log run. So what happened here is we have index.html, which includes RequireJS. RequireJS knows which script tag was leveraged. It goes and finds the data-main. Now you don't have to use data-main. And it says my initial module is lib/main. And so now we've offloaded. Typically, this is the extent of the work I do in HTML files when I'm doing clients. This is it. Everything else I offloaded to JavaScript construction.
And it loads those JavaScripts asynchronously then? So they're not...
It does, yeah. So main, it oftentimes will have tons of dependencies,
Yeah.
and it'll wait for all the dependencies to be loaded, map them to their corresponding arguments, which I'm going to show you in a second, and then execute them accordingly. However, sometimes you don't want to take advantage of that asynchronous parallel loading because it makes sense just to build to one file. You don't need to defer anything like the chat example earlier. So oftentimes you'll take this entry point, you'll give it to RJS and say trace my dependencies, build it, and minify it, and so you can have one nice little thing. Where the asynchronous comes in is you don't have to do a build while you're developing, which is really nice with AMD. I don't have to sit there and run a build every time I save a file. My errors actually show up from the, like if we were to throw an error in this lib main, typically if this were built into a, see what actually shows up is coming from main, it's because it's actually that file. It's not building into some weird one file right now. I can actually reference the same file it's from. So I'm going to give this a dependency, and we're going to call that 1. So, and then we're going to map it to 1. One is not going to have, so I'm going to again call define to define my module. Then I'm going to return my interface. It's all syntactic and just teaches me that I don't care about semicolons. That's all it's done for me. So this syntax, when you return something out of a module, that becomes the entry point. That's what gets mapped to the argument of your callback. So now what I can say is the interface I'm exporting is hey. That's what you can call it. It's an object and it's hey. You can return functions out of here. You can return pretty much anything out of here. But what's really nice about this is it gives you some of that protection that you typically have coming from an object-oriented language. Namely, I can implement a facade interface where my API is stable, and I can do some real nasty stuff in there just to prove the interface. Once the interface is good, then I can implement it, and my API consumers aren't affected by that.
So,
Please.
yeah, in the main JS, can you go back to that?
Absolutely.
It all went too fast for me, I guess.
No.
Where did the one and stuff go? You had some kind of, was that in RequireJS?
Is it in index?
Where in the heck was that thing? Where you said,
Where I started to do the
One is
arguments thing,
mapped.
I undid that because I was like, oh man, I'm jumping the gun.
oh, okay.
Your attention span is great though because like I forgot about that. So
And that's
I'll
where
go
I
ahead.
got lost.
I'm going to bring it back to that, but I wanted to just show how you return your interface.
Okay, so now in the main,
Now in the main, we want to consume module 1. Okay?
oh, okay, so one's not going to show up anywhere
Nope,
right now.
it's nowhere right now.
Okay,
It's like some unknown
now I
magic thing. Yeah. So what we can do though is we can now consume 1 by giving it its module path. So this could be, to give you an example, this could be, mutuals class, for example. Now we go into a folder called mutuals and it fetches the class module. That could be jQuery and we return the $sign. In this case, we're using our own module, which happens to be 1, and I'm going to map it to 1. So now I can say 1.hey, console.log 1, just so you guys can see it.
Okay, so that function thing up there, you're passing it.
Yeah, so this is the callback that will be executed once all of your dependencies are loaded, okay? 1 doesn't happen to have any dependencies, so I omitted that first array parameter. So what's going to happen is, it's going to go find 1, it's going to see where the defined call is, it doesn't necessarily have to be at the top, and it's going to find the callback. First it's going to trace the dependencies, it's going to find the callback, and it's going to run it. Whatever's returned from that callback becomes the interface into that module.
Okay, and what's being returned here is the string hey and...
Oh no, this is a JavaScript object.
An object, yeah.
See the 2 curlies?
That's what I do.
Yeah.
That's different.
Sorry,
It's not scope, that's an actual object.
that's a object literal is what they're called. Just key value. Value can be functions.
So what happens if you get an incompetent developer that manages to write a circular dependency?
RequireJS actually handles them. It can be frustrating sometimes. The way that it's handled is that you have to use common JS syntax. But one of the things about, like you said, usually a circular dependency like that is a sign of a not so good design. But RequireJS does let you do it. And they have a thing on the website that'll explain how that works. Good question, by the way. So we have our 1 module, which is returning an object literal, which is the hey key, right? Now I'm requiring the 1 module, I'm mapping it to 1, and I'm calling that hey. So this is that object that was returned, and this is that hey method.
Gotcha.
So if I come back here, we have that hey echoed. If I go over here to console, we can inspect this, and it's an anonymous object with hey as the interface. Rather than saying 1.hey is equal to this function and polluting the Windows space, or making it so no one else could consume the 1 module unless they attach it to their global space, we now have an anonymous API that we can toss around between projects. One of the interesting things is these are completely subjective. So we're doing that TWOL, which I have no idea why I did that. We get hey from TWOL. So even though the module is still exporting like its interface. We actually named it TWLL in our case, and we're able to reference it that way. So if you could think about this in terms of a more useful context, we could require jQuery, and then we could require, I don't know how you call it, Modules class, and then Modules class, if it installs a dollar sign, we could actually rename it to like something else. So we have jQuery, something else, and that would work just fine. We're passing around these JavaScript modules. Is this a query handle on AMD? And we get what's happening here with the modules, tracing dependencies, fetching them, and mapping them to arguments? Okay. So this, I'm going to show you guys, we're actually going to walk through this other project, which is a little bit more of a practical project. So remember, I've got the jQuery module, I've got the backbone module, and I'm mapping them to $ and backbone. I could very well map that to something else. I could call that, yay query or something. Then I'm making a backbone object, and I'm just returning it. So this module represents this backbone router. Whatever you return is what we'll use. So this is actually a constructor. And in my index.html, I still have that data-main, which is over here, JavaScript/bootstrap. So the entry point is going to configure RequireJS, and it's going to require that app player I just showed you guys, which is a backbone router. Going to map it to this player, and then I'm going to say new player, and then start history.
But there's no define in this one?
No. This is the entry point. You don't necessarily have to define something with your entry point.
Okay.
You can just use require, because this isn't really a module, this is more an entry point. I'm not exporting an API at all. I'm consuming modules, but I'm not really exporting anything. Does that make sense? So I know that was a ton, but I'll focus in on the other stuff a little bit later. So, like I said, these are aliases, by the way. So you can say require jQuery, it'll actually dig into vendor jQuery and accordingly. So if we were to load this up, RequireJS, and when RequireJS hits index,